The scan came back wrong, and reader Osenvel knew it the instant the numbers stopped climbing. He had run 40,000 scans in his service. He had read the insides of merchant haulers and dead moons, and the bones of ships older than his own bloodline. A scan was a simple thing. You aimed the beam, you waited. The machine told you what a thing was made of and how heavy it was, and whether it could hurt you. The machine never lied. The machine was the one honest thing in a galaxy full of liars. So when the readout for the drifting human hull froze and then began to do something the machine had never done before, Osenvel did not panic. He leaned closer to the glass and frowned with all four of his reading eyes and assumed, the way any careful officer would, that the fault was on his side. It was not on his side. The hull hung in front of the survey cruiser like a closed door in deep space. It was old. Anyone could see it was old. Its plating was the dull gray of metal that had been cold for a very long time, scarred in long pale streaks where micrometeors had kissed it across the centuries. It did not glow. It did not hum on any band Osenvel could hear. By every law he had been taught, the thing should have been a wreck, a tomb, a salvage claim worth a quiet bonus and an early shift home. The survey ship that found it was named the Patient Harvest, and her people were the Sithraxi, and the Sithraxi did not salvage the dead. They ate them. That was the simplest way the younger crew put it, and it was close enough to true. The Sithraxi did not build their warships the way most species did, plate by welded plate. They grew them. Deep in the warm dark of their nest worlds, in vats the size of cities, they seeded living hull flesh onto frames of bred bone, and they fed those frames the chewed-up bodies of whatever fleets had been foolish enough to meet them in the open. A Sithraxi war host did not leave debris behind. It left nothing behind. It arrived hungry and it left fat, and the worlds it passed remembered it as a silence, where ships used to be. For 900 years, the galaxy had learned that lesson the same way, over and over, and the lesson was this: do not let the devourers smell your iron. Osenvel had grown up on that lesson. He had been weaned on recordings of the Maw fleets folding around enemy formations like a mouth closing, of armored cruisers going soft and gray as the hull flesh climbed them and drank them down to nothing in the span of a single watch. He had cheered, as a hatchling, the way all the hatchlings cheered. He did not cheer now. He was 40 years into a career of reading things, and he had learned somewhere in those 40 years that a thing you do not understand is more dangerous than a thing you hate. And he did not understand the human hull. The first part of the scan had been ordinary. Length, 1,100 meters, nose to stern, old human battleship configuration, blunt and heavy and graceless, the sort of thing a species built before it learned subtlety. Power signature, nearly zero. Crew signs, none the beam could find. Threat assessment, the machine offered cheerfully, negligible. There was a name on the hull, too, in the old human script that the translation banks could still read, painted along the bow in letters 3 meters tall, faded but legible after all the centuries. The adamant hearth, Osenvel logged it without thought, the way he logged the markings on any wreck, a small dead detail for the record. He did not know yet that it was the only true thing the human hull would ever tell him. He did not know yet that everything else his instruments said about the ship would turn out to be a lie his own machines were telling him, and that the name would be the one fact that held. It struck him as a strange name even then, in the first idle minute, before the trouble started. A hearth was a fire you kept. A hearth was a warm place you came back to. It was a soft, small, gentle word, and someone had painted it 3 meters tall on the bow of a battleship, and Osenvel filed the oddness away and forgot it, because he had a scan to finish and a bonus to earn and no reason in the world to think a dead ship's name might matter. Then the mass reading had come in, and the trouble had begun. Mass was the one number you could not argue with. Mass was honest in a way even light was not. A thing weighed what it weighed, and the beam measured the bend it put into space around it, and that was that. The machine looked at the 1,100-meter human hull and told Osenvel that it weighed what a hull that size should weigh, and he nodded and reached to log the find. And then the number changed. It did not jump. It did not flicker the way a glitch flickers. It climbed, slow and smooth and steady, like a tide coming in. The mass of the dead human battleship was rising while he watched it, while nothing about the hull on his glass moved at all, while the scarred gray door of it hung exactly as still as it had hung when he found it. Orson Welles sat very still and watched a corpse get heavier. He told himself it was sensor drift. He recalibrated the beam, the way the manuals said, and aimed it again, and the new reading came back higher than the last, and then it began to climb again from there. He told himself it was a field distortion, some old human trick of shielding meant to fool salvagers, and he widened the band and looked through it, and the mass beneath the trick was higher still. Every time he tried to catch the number standing still, it had already moved, and it had only ever moved one direction, up. He had a junior reader beside him, a young one named Threll Asha, barely past her second molt, and she had been trained on the same machines he had. She saw the climb on her own glass, and she made the small clicking sound the Sithraxi make when something frightens them before their minds have caught up to why. "Reader," she said, "the mass, it is not settling." "I see it," he said. "Dead hulls settle. You aim, it answers, it holds. This one is not holding." "I see it," he said again, more quietly, because he did not want her to hear what was underneath his voice. What was underneath his voice was this: a dead thing has a weight, and that weight does not change, because death is the end of change. That was the most basic truth in the whole science of reading the dark. You could trust a corpse to lie still. The human battleship was lying still in every way his eyes could see, and growing heavier in the only way that could not be faked, and the two facts could not both be true, and yet the machine, the honest machine, the one thing in the galaxy that did not lie, was telling him they were. He did the thing a careful officer does when his instrument tells him something impossible. He stopped trusting his eyes and started trusting the number. He let the scan run. It ran for one full Sithraxi watch, which is a little under 9 of the hours the humans used. For 9 hours Orson Welles sat in the dim red glow of the reading deck and watched the mass of an 1,100-meter corpse climb past what an 1,100-meter hull could weigh, past what a hull twice that size could weigh, past the weight of the patient harvest herself, and keep going. By the 4th hour the number had passed the mass of a Sithraxi heavy cruiser. By the 6th, it had passed the mass of a nest mother, the great living dreadnoughts that anchored a maw fleet, ships 11 kilometers long and grown across 300 years. By the 8th hour, the dead human battleship in front of the patient harvest weighed more than the patient harvest, and the nest mother, and every other ship in the survey flotilla, all of them together, with margin left over. And it had not moved. And its power signature was still nearly zero, and the threat assessment, which the machine updated on its own without being asked, still read negligible, because the machine had been built by the Sithraxi, and the Sithraxi had never built a machine that could imagine what it was looking at. Threll Asha had gone quiet beside him a long time ago. When she finally spoke, her voice had the high, thin edge of someone who has been doing arithmetic she wishes she had not done. "Reader, if the mass is real, it is real. Mass does not lie. If it is real, then it should pull on us. A thing that heavy, we should feel it. The harvest should be drifting toward it by now. We are not drifting. The instruments say it is there, and the instruments say we are not falling toward it. Both cannot be true." Orson Welles looked at her, and for the first time in 40 years of reading, he had no honest answer to give a junior, and he hated that more than he could say. "No," he agreed, "both cannot be true." He should have logged it then. He should have flagged the find as anomalous, sealed the scan record, and recommended to the flotilla command that the patient harvest withdraw to a safe distance and pass the problem to the deep readers and the priests, who were paid to think about impossible things. That was procedure. That was what a careful officer did. He had been a careful officer for 40 years, and it had kept him alive in a service that ate its own dead. He did not do it, because the order came down from above him before he could. The order came from Flotilla Master Gon Sethi, who commanded the 6 survey ships of the Patient Harvest's pack, and who had never in his life met a dead thing he did not intend to eat. Gon Sethi heard human battleship, and no crew, and no power, and stopped listening at that point, the way confident men do. He did not hear the part about the climbing mass, or he heard it and did not believe it, which among the Sithraxi amounted to the same thing. His order was 3 words long, and it came in the flat tone of a man who expected to be obeyed and rewarded. Take the hull. Osen Vel read the order on his glass. He read it again, then he looked up at the scarred gray door hanging in the dark, the corpse that weighed more than his whole world and would not move and would not fall, and he felt, for the first time since he was a hatchling, the cold, pure animal certainty that he was about to watch something terrible, and that there was nothing at all he could do to stop it. He turned to Threll Asha. He kept his voice level, because she was young and frightened, and one of them ought to sound like he was not. Log everything, he told her. Every reading, every second, from now until it ends. Until what ends, reader? He looked back at the human hull. I don't know yet, he said, but I want a record. I think someone is going to need to know exactly what we did, and exactly when we should have stopped. The Sithraxi did not board ships. They opened them. A boarding was something other species did, with armored bodies and breaching charges, and a great deal of shouting, and it was crude and slow and cost lives. The Sithraxi had a better way. They grew it. From the belly of every survey ship hung a thing they called a feeder vine, a living tendril of hull flesh 20 meters thick and half a kilometer long, blind and patient, and very, very hungry. You laid the feeder vine against an enemy hull, and you waited, and the flesh found a seam or a weld or a wound, and it slid inside, and then it ate the ship from the inside out, while the crew, if there were any crew, learned in their last minutes exactly how the galaxy felt about the Sithraxi. Gon Sethi ordered the Patient Harvest to lay her feeder vine against the dead human battleship, and the crew obeyed, because the alternative to obeying Gon Sethi was being fed to the same machine. Osen Vel watched it on his glass. The vine uncoiled from the Harvest's belly, gray and glistening, and reached across the dark toward the scarred human hull. The whole reading deck had gone silent. Even the confident ones, the young hunters who had cheered the recordings, watched without a sound. Some part of them, the old animal part underneath the confidence, had finally started to do the arithmetic that Threll Asha had done 6 hours before. The feeder vine touched the human hull. For a moment, nothing happened. The vine lay against the cold gray plating like a tongue against a wall. The mass reading kept climbing, slow and steady, the way it had climbed for 9 hours. The threat assessment still read negligible. And Osen Vel let himself hope, in the foolish way frightened people hope, that he had been wrong, that it was only sensor drift after all, that the great heavy corpse was only a corpse, and the vine would slide in, and the whole flotilla would feast and laugh and forget. It did not wake the way a warship wakes, with a flare of engines and a snarl of weapons coming online. That Osen Vel could have understood. That he was braced for. The human hull woke the way the sea wakes. The dull gray plating, which had hung dead and dark for who knew how many centuries, did not light up. It deepened. A faint shift ran across the entire 1,100 meters of it, bow to stern, like a held breath finally being let go, and every instrument on the reading deck flinched at once. The mass reading stopped climbing. It did not fall. It simply stopped and held. And for the first time in 9 hours the number on Osen Vel's glass was still, and somehow that stillness was worse than all the climbing had been, because it meant the thing had reached whatever weight it had been reaching for. It had finished becoming whatever it was becoming. It was, at last, exactly as heavy as it meant to be. And then the feeder vine began to scream. It had no mouth, and no throat, and no way to scream, and so the scream came up through the Harvest's own hull flesh, as a vibration, a deep wet shudder that ran through the living ship and into the deck and into the bones of every Sithraxi aboard her. The vine was made of the same flesh as the ship. The vine was, in a real sense, part of the ship, and the vine had laid itself against the human hull expecting to feed, and instead the human hull was feeding on it. Osenvel watched the readings and could not make them mean anything for several seconds, and then he could, and he wished he could not. The vine was being unmade, not burned, not cut, not crushed, unmade. The living whole flesh, cell by cell, was coming apart where it touched the human plating, and the matter that had been the vine was not floating away into the dark, as ash and gas the way burned things did. It was going into the human hull. It was being added to it. The mass that the dead battleship had spent 9 hours climbing toward had stopped climbing the instant it tasted the vine, and now Osenvel understood why, and the understanding sat in his belly like a stone. The mass had stopped because the hull had found a closer meal. "Pull it back," he heard himself say. "Master Gon Sethi, pull back the vine. Pull it back now." But the vine would not pull back. It was a living thing, and living things in agony do not obey. It thrashed against the human hull, and every place it thrashed it was unmade a little faster, and the patient harvest, joined to her own vine by flesh and nerve, began to thrash with it. The deck heaved, the red lights guttered. Somewhere below, in the warm, wet heart of the ship where the Sithraxi grew their young, and their weapons, and their food, something that had never been meant to feel pain was feeling all of it at once. Gon Sethi's voice came over the deck, and for the first time it had lost its flatness. "Sever the vine, cut it loose and burn the wound shut." They cut it loose. It is not a small thing to sever a feeder vine. It is 1/2 kilometer of living tissue full of nerve and hunger, and the Sithraxi grew them precisely because they were so hard to lose, because an enemy could not simply cut you free of your prey. The harvest's crew burned through their own flesh with cutting fire, 1/2 kilometer up the vine, where it met the belly of the ship, and they sealed the wound with the same fire, and the severed length of vine, 20 meters thick, and now wholly given over to the human hull, went on being unmade until there was nothing left of it at all. The deck stopped heaving. The red light steadied. The patient harvest had cut off her own hand to keep from being dragged into the mouth, and she had succeeded, and she floated now in the dark a wounded thing, leaking and shaking and afraid. It was the first time in 900 years that a Sithraxi ship had ever cut its own feeder vine free of a prey. Osenvel knew that, because he had read the histories the way a careful reader reads everything. The feeder vine was the pride of his people, the thing that made them the terror of the dark, the long, blind, hungry hand that found the seam in every hull and drank the crew before they could even understand what was happening to them. No prey had ever made a Sithraxi let go. Worlds had burned their own skies trying. Fleets had thrown themselves against the maw and been swallowed, and here, in a quiet system at the edge of nowhere, a single dead-looking human battleship with no power and no crew and no weapons that any instrument could find had made the patient harvest sever her own hand and flee, simply by lying still and letting itself be touched. Osenvel logged that too. He marked it in the record as a thing that had never happened before, so that whoever read the log after him would understand exactly how far outside the known world they had already wandered, and they were not, he was certain, anywhere near the end of it. And the human battleship hung in front of her exactly as it had before, scarred and gray and still. The faint, deep shift had passed across it and gone. The sea had woken and tasted and gone back to sleep. The threat assessment on Osenvel's glass, the threat assessment built by the Sithraxi who could not imagine this, updated itself once more, with the same flat confidence it had shown all along. Negligible. Osenvel laughed. It was not a good sound. Threll Asha looked at him with naked fear, and he made himself stop. "Reader," she whispered, "what is it? What did we touch?" He did not answer her, because he was reading. The scan was still running, the way he had told her to keep it running, and now that the hull had woken and tasted and slept again, the scan was giving him something it had not given him before. The shift that had passed across the hull had opened a door, just for an instant, just wide enough for the beam to slip inside, and for one fraction of 1 second, Osenvel had seen what was beneath the scarred gray plating of the dead human battleship. He had seen the inside of it. And the inside of it was not the inside of a battleship. A battleship, even a human one, even an old one, is mostly empty. It is decks and corridors and bunks and magazines, machinery and air, and the small warm spaces where a crew lives. There is a great deal of nothing inside a warship, because a warship is built around the people who fly it, and people need room. Osunvel had read the insides of 1,000 warships, and they were all, underneath, the same kind of mostly hollow thing. The human battleship was not hollow. It was solid, from the scarred gray skin of it all the way down to wherever its heart was. Every reading the beam brought back said the same impossible thing. There was no empty space inside the human hull, none. Not a corridor, not a bunk, not a breath of air. The whole 1,100 meters of it was packed, dense, layered, folded in on itself like nothing the Sithraxi had ever grown or built or eaten, and the deeper the beam looked, the denser it got, and at some point down near the center, the beam simply stopped coming back at all, because whatever was at the center of the human battleship was too heavy for light to climb out of. That was where the mass had been going, not into the hull, into the heart. The thing had spent 9 hours, or 9 centuries, or 9,000 years, pulling itself inward, folding itself denser and denser around a center that the light could not escape, and the only reason it had stopped folding was that the Sithraxi had been kind enough to offer it something easier to eat than itself. Threllasha was looking at the same readings on her own glass. She was very young, and she was very smart, and Osunvel watched her be smart, watched her chase the numbers to the same place he had chased them, and he wished he could have spared her the arrival. "There's no crew," she said slowly. "There was never any crew. There's no room for a crew. There's no room for anything. It isn't a ship that died. It's—" She stopped. "Say it," Osunvel said gently. "We're logging everything. Say it for the record. It's a ship that was never alive in the first place," she said. "It's a weight. Someone built a weight and shaped it like a battleship and put it out here in the dark to be found. It's bait. The whole thing is bait." She was wrong, but she was wrong in exactly the way a careful, frightened, intelligent person should be wrong, and Osunvel did not correct her, because he did not yet know how to. He knew it was not bait, because bait is a thing you set and walk away from, and the human hull was not set and forgotten. It was awake. It had tasted the vine and chosen, on its own, in some way that had nothing to do with crews or captains or power signatures, to stop folding inward and to unmake the thing that touched it instead. A weight does not choose. The human hull had chosen. Which meant that somewhere inside that solid, folded, lightless 1,100 meters, something was deciding things, and Osunvel had no idea what it was, and he had a flotilla master one deck up who still thought he was hunting a corpse. He sent the readings up the chain, all of them. The climbing mass, the woken sea, the unmade vine, the solid, lightless heart, the choice. He attached every recording Threllasha had logged. He marked it with the highest flag a reader was permitted to raise, the flag that meant withdraw and consult, the flag that meant this is beyond us. Gon Sethi read it, or did not read it, and gave a new order, and the new order told Osunvel everything he needed to know about how the next hours were going to go. The new order was, bring up the rest of the pack. The Patient Harvest was one ship of 6. The other 5 survey vessels of Gon Sethi's pack were spread across the system, mapping, 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 the endless patient work of the Sithraxi as they catalogued every system before they fed on it. Gon Sethi called them in. He had lost a vine to the dead human hull, and Gon Sethi was not a man who lost things and let it go. He had decided that one survey ship and one feeder vine had simply not been enough hunger for the job. He would bring 6. Osunvel watched the 5 other ships turn in the dark and start the long fall inward toward the human battleship, and he understood that there was a kind of mind that could only ever answer a problem with more of the thing that had already failed, and that Gon Sethi had that kind of mind, and that a great many Sithraxi were about to die for it. He did not say this to Gon Sethi. You did not say things like that to a flotilla master, and keep your reading eyes. He said it instead to Threll Asha, very quietly, while the 5 ships fell inward and the dead hull hung waiting. Watch the mass, he told her. Now that it's stopped climbing, watch it very carefully when the other ships get close. Why, reader? Because I want to know if it's full, he said. I want to know if the thing has a limit. It folded for 9 hours and stopped. Maybe it stopped because it was finished, or maybe it stopped because we fed it, and it would rather eat than fold. If it's the second one, he didn't finish. Threll Asha finished it for him, because she was smart and because the logging needed it. If it's the second one, she said, then it isn't full, then it's hungry, and we're bringing it 5 more meals. Yes, said Ausenvel. The 5 ships came in over the next watch. They were not careless ships. Word had spread through the pack, the way fear spreads through any crew, and the captains of the 5 came in slow and wary, with their feeder vines coiled tight and their cutting fire ready. They had seen the harvest's readings. They did not intend to make the harvest's mistake. They made a different one. They assumed the danger was in touching it. The human hull let them come close, all 5 of them, arrayed around it in a loose sphere, close enough to read it deep, far enough that no vine touched its skin. And for a long while nothing happened, and the captains of the 5 began to speak to one another with a little more confidence, and Gon Sethi's voice on the command channel grew flat and sure again, and Ausenvel sat on the reading deck of the Patient Harvest and watched the mass number and waited for it to tell him the truth. It told him. The mass began to climb again. Not on the human hull, on the 5 survey ships. One by one, in the order they had arrived, the survey ships of Gon Sethi's pack began to get heavier, smoothly and steadily, exactly the way the human battleship had gotten heavier for 9 hours. The number on each ship rose like a tide coming in, and the captains of the 5 did not feel it, because mass is not a thing you feel until it is far too late, and Ausenvel watched it climb on his glass and felt the stone in his belly grow teeth. "Reader," Threll Asha breathed. "It's reading them. It scanned us. It's been scanning us this whole time. We pointed our beam at it, and the whole time, it was pointing something back." And that was the truth, or as close to the truth as the Sithraxi would ever come. The human battleship had not been a corpse waking. It had not been bait. It had been a thing that, the moment the first beam touched it, had begun, in the patient lightless dark of its solid heart, to read the readers. For 9 hours, while Ausenvel measured its climbing mass and chased its impossible numbers and decided, carefully, professionally, that the danger was beyond him, the human hull had been measuring him. Measuring all of them. Learning the precise weight and shape and hunger of the Sithraxi, who ate ships, who grew their weapons, who could only ever answer a problem with more mouths. And now it knew them. And now, having let them gather, having let them bring up the rest of the pack, having learned everything there was to learn about how the Sithraxi were made, the human battleship had decided what to do with all that they had so generously shown it. The 5 survey ships got heavier. The human hull got nothing. The mass was not transferring. It was not being eaten and added the way the vine had been. It was simply appearing, out of nowhere, inside the bodies of the 5 Sithraxi ships, more of it every second, a weight that came from somewhere the beam could not see, and pressed down and down into the warm living hearts of the pack. "What is it doing to them?" Gon Sethi's voice demanded, and it had lost its flatness again, and this time it did not get it back. "Reader, answer me. What is it doing to my ships?" Ausenvel looked at the readings. He looked at the 5 ships getting heavier in the dark, and the dead human battleship hanging still and patient at the center of them, and he gave the flotilla master the only honest answer he had. "It's giving them weight, master," he said. "It scanned us. It found out what we are. And now it's giving us the one thing, a thing made of hunger, can never carry." "Which is what?" Gon Sethi snarled. Ausenvel watched the first of the 5 survey ships begin, very slowly, to fold. "More than we can hold," he said. The first survey ship was named the Soft Tide, and she had a crew of 400, and she folded over the course of 11 minutes, and Ausenvel watched every second of it, because he had ordered the logging and could not now look away from what he had asked to be recorded. There was a moment, right at the start, where the captain of the Soft Tide did not believe it either. Ausenvel heard her on the command channel, a hunter named Velka Sorn, confident the way they were all confident, telling Gon Sethi that her readings showed a minor field distortion and that she would adjust and hold position. Her voice was steady. Her voice was the voice of someone who had spent her whole life trusting her machines and had never once been betrayed by them, and Ausenvel listened to that steady voice and wanted to shout across the dark at her, to tell her to run, to tell her the distortion was not minor and would not adjust, and he did not, because there was nothing to run toward and nothing she could have done, and because a part of him still did not fully believe it himself. So he listened to Velka Sorn report a minor field distortion in a steady voice, and he listened to her voice stop being steady, and he listened to it stop being a voice, all in the space of those 11 minutes, and he never forgot the sound of confidence turning into understanding, turning into silence, because it was the sound his whole people would make, in the end, if they did not learn. The weight came on her the way water fills a sinking thing. At first it did nothing but make her readings climb. Then it began to make her shape wrong. A Sithraxi ship is grown, not built, and a grown thing can be hurt the way flesh is hurt, and the Soft Tide began to be hurt by her own mass. Her hull flesh, which had been bred to hold a certain weight and no more, was suddenly holding 100 times that, then 1,000, then a number that meant nothing, and the flesh did what overburdened flesh does. It gave. Slowly, terribly, with no fire and no sound that traveled through vacuum, the Soft Tide began to sag inward toward her own center, decks pressing down on decks, the great warm spaces where 400 Sithraxi lived and worked, and feared collapsing one into the next, as the weight that had appeared inside her dragged everything she was down toward a point too small to hold it. She did not explode. That was the worst of it, Ausenvel would think later. In the long years he had to think about it. An explosion would have been a death he understood. The Soft Tide did not explode. She folded, the way the human battleship had folded across 9 hours, except that the human hull had done it slowly and on purpose, and the Soft Tide did it in 11 screaming minutes against her will, and at the end of those 11 minutes there was no Soft Tide. There was a point in the dark, very small, very heavy, that the beam could not see into, exactly like the lightless heart of the human battleship. The Soft Tide had become the same kind of thing the human hull was. She had been given weight, and the weight had taught her what the human battleship already knew, which was how to fall forever into yourself and never reach the bottom. The other 4 ships ran. There is no shame in saying it. Their captains were not cowards. They had watched the Soft Tide fold, and they had understood, in the clean, cold way that fear makes understanding, that they could not fight a thing that simply made them too heavy to exist, and so they did the only sane thing, which was to put their engines to full and try to climb out of the dark toward their flotilla master and the open black beyond. They did not climb out. The weight was already in them. It had been in them since they arrived, growing quietly while their captain spoke with confidence, and now that the human hull had decided, the weight in the 4 running ships did to them exactly what it had done to the Soft Tide, except that it did it to them while they ran, so that they folded in flight, one after another, points of unbearable mass appearing in the dark where ships had been, each one a little farther out than the last, as the dying engines carried the dying ships, those few last useless meters toward home. In 19 minutes, the pack of the Patient Harvest went from 6 ships to 1. Only the Harvest was left, and the Harvest was left only because she had already cut off her own hand, already pulled back, already wounded herself to escape the mouth. She hung farthest out of all of them, and the human hull, for reasons Ausenvel could not read and would never know, did not give her weight. It let her live. It let one ship live, the way a thing that has just shown you exactly what it can do will sometimes let one of you live, because a lesson with no one left to learn it is not a lesson at all. Ausenvel had a moment then, a small, terrible moment, when he understood the whole shape of the thing, and he wished he had not. He pulled up the very first scan, the one he had run 9 hours ago, the ordinary one, length and configuration and crew signs and the threat assessment that read negligible. He set it beside the readings the dying ships had given him in the last 19 minutes, and he saw, laid out plainly on his own glass, the thing the human hull had been doing the whole time, the thing he had not let himself see because no careful reader could afford to see it. The Adamant Hearth, the human battleship, had a name printed on its hull in the old human script, and Osenvel had logged that name on the very first scan without thinking about it, the way you log the markings on any wreck. It had meant nothing to him then. It meant everything to him now, because the more he looked at the readings, the more he understood that the human hull had not done a single thing to his ships that his ships had not first done to it. They had scanned it, and it had scanned them. They had reached for it with a feeder vine, and it had reached back. They had gathered to feed on it, and it had let them gather, and then it had fed them, in the most exact and terrible sense of that word, on the only thing it had to give. Every move the Sithraxi made, the human hull answered with the same move turned around, like a thing standing in front of a mirror, like a thing that was a mirror, and Osenvel sat on the reading deck, with the proof of it laid out on his glass, and could not make himself say it aloud, because saying it aloud would mean admitting that there was no attack to defend against, because the attack was the Sithraxi themselves. Gon Sethi understood none of this. Gon Sethi had just watched 5 ships and 2,000 of his people fold into points in the dark, and the part of his mind that should have understood the lesson was the part of his mind he had never used, and so he reached, as he had always reached, for more. "All hunger," he said on the command channel, and his voice was shaking now, but it was shaking with rage and not with sense. "Every nest mother in range, every maw fleet that can hear me, there is a human weapon in this system that has eaten 5 of my ships, and I will see it cracked open, and I will see what is inside it. Come, all of you, come and feed." Osenvel closed his reading eyes. He had spent 40 years learning that the deadliest thing in the dark is not a thing you hate, but a thing you do not understand, and he had just watched a flotilla master prove it, by hating the one thing in the galaxy he should have run from. And now Gon Sethi was calling the maw fleets. He was calling the nest mothers, the 11-kilometer living dreadnoughts that anchored the whole power of the Sithraxi, the ships that had emptied 1,000 worlds. He was calling them to a place where a single dead-looking human battleship had just folded 5 ships into nothing by doing nothing more than letting itself be scanned. "Threlasha," Osenvel said quietly, "are you still logging?" "Yes, reader." Her voice was very small. "Good. Keep logging, and add this, in my voice, marked as a reader's judgment for the record." He opened his eyes. "We did not find a weapon. A weapon is a thing one species makes to use against another. This is not that. We scanned it, and it scanned us back, and in the scanning it learned what we are, and what we are is a species that turns everything it meets into food and weight and more mouths, and it has decided to give us back exactly what we are. It is not killing us. It is showing us to ourselves. The soft tide did not die. She became a Sithraxi ship that had finally been given enough to eat. She ate until there was nothing left of her but appetite folded into a point. That is not murder, Threlasha. That is a mirror." The young reader was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in the voice of someone who has understood something she will never be able to put down again, "Then the maw fleets are not coming to destroy it. They are coming to be shown." "Yes," said Osenvel. "The maw fleets came. They came over the next 2 days, falling in out of the dark from every direction, because Gon Sethi was a flotilla master of standing, and his call carried weight, even if his judgment did not, and because the chance to crack open a human weapon and feed on whatever was inside it was exactly the kind of glory a maw fleet existed to chase. Nest mothers, the great living dreadnoughts, 11 of them, each one 11 kilometers of bred bone and grown flesh, each one trailing a swarm of war-grown cruisers and the long blind hungry feeder vines that had drunk 1,000 fleets. By the end of the second day there were 440 Sithraxi warships gathered in the dark around the dead human battleship, the single largest war host the pack had assembled in a generation, and at the center of all of it, 1,100 meters of scarred gray stillness, hung the thing they had come to eat. Osenvel tried to warn them. This is the part of the record he was most careful with, in the long years after, because he did not want anyone to think he had sat silent while it happened. He sent his readings to every ship in the gathering host as they arrived: the curve, the proof, the climbing number, the 5 folded ships. He flagged it with the highest mark a reader could raise. He attached his own judgment, in his own voice, the words about the mirror, the words about a thing that gives you back what you are. He did everything a reader was permitted to do, and several things a reader was not, and he watched the warnings land on 440 bridges and changed nothing at all, because the captains of the host read negligible on their own machines, and they trusted their machines, the way Osenvel himself had trusted his machine for the first 8 of the 9 hours before the truth arrived. A weapons reader on one of the nest mothers, an old one named Dovril Kayan who had read the dark almost as long as Osenvel had, answered him directly, on a private band, captain to captain across the gulf of the host. Osenvel kept that exchange in the record too, word for word, because it was the closest any other Sithraxi came to seeing. "You are saying it cannot be cracked," Dovril Kayan said. "I am saying every scan makes it heavier," Osenvel answered. "I am saying it has folded everything that has touched it. I am saying the more of us look at it, the stronger it gets, and there are 440 of us about to look at it at once." There was a long silence on the band. When Dovril Kayan spoke again, his voice was tired, in a way that told Osenvel the old reader half believed him and knew it would not matter. "Then I will read it gently," Dovril Kayan said. "A soft scan, a careful one. Enough to find the seam, not enough to wake it." "There is no gentle way to look at it," Osenvel said. "That is the whole of what I have learned. It does not care how softly you look. It only counts that you looked." Dovril Kayan did not answer that. He could not. He was a reader, and a reader follows orders, and the order had come down from 11 nest mothers and a flotilla master who wanted the human weapon cracked, and so the old reader signed off the private band and went to do the only thing his people had ever known how to do, to a thing they did not understand, which was to point a beam at it and learn its weight. It had not moved, it had not fired, its power signature was still nearly 0, and its threat assessment, on every glass in every ship in that vast host, still read negligible, because they were all Sithraxi machines, and the Sithraxi had still never built a machine that could imagine the thing in front of it. It had not moved, it had not fired, its power signature was still nearly 0, and its threat assessment, on every glass in every ship in that vast host, still read negligible, because they were all Sithraxi machines, and the Sithraxi had still never built a machine that could imagine the thing in front of it. Osenvel sat on the reading deck of the Patient Harvest, at the far edge of the host, the one survived ship of the first pack, and he watched 440 warships array themselves to feed on a thing that had folded 5 of them by doing nothing, and he understood that he was about to witness the largest single act of suicide in the history of his people, and that he would not be permitted to stop it, and that the only thing left for him to do was exactly what he was doing. Watch, log, remember. It scanned 5 ships and folded them, Threlasha said beside him. Her fear had burned down to something flat and clear, the way fear does when it has lasted long enough. Reader, what does it do when 440 ships point their beams at it at once? When the whole host scans it, all together, to find the seam to crack? It was a very good question. It was the only question, and Osenvel, who had read the dark for 40 years, knew the answer the way you know a thing in your body before your mind agrees to it. "It learns all of them at once," he said. "Every ship that points a beam at it shows it exactly what that ship is made of, and how heavy it is, and how it is grown. We thought the scan was ours. The scan was never ours. The scan is how it eats. We have spent 2 days gathering 440 ships into one place and aiming our beams at the one thing in the galaxy that gets stronger every time it is read." He stood up. He did not know why he stood up. There was nothing to do standing that he could not do sitting, but it felt wrong to witness the end of so many of his people sitting down, and so he stood, and he watched the host of the Sithraxi prepare to scan the human battleship in unison, the way they always did before a feeding, to find the place where the prey was weakest. And in the lightless folded heart of the dead human hull, the thing that decided things finished, at last, learning what the Sithraxi were. There was, it turned out, one human aboard the dead battleship after all. The Sithraxi never knew this. Ausenvel never knew it. Their beams had told them the hull was solid, crewless, lightless, and the beams had not lied, exactly, but the beams had been reading a thing they had no word for, and a thing you have no word for can hide a great deal in plain sight. Her name was Beatrix Holloway, and she was, by the old human ranks that no longer meant anything, the ship's keeper. Not the captain, not a gunner, not an engineer. A keeper was the person who stayed with a ship after a ship was done, the way a few species kept a single mourner with the honored dead, and the human battleship Adamant Hearth had been done for a very long time. 800 years, by the count the ship still kept, though Beatrix had stopped counting in centuries, somewhere along the way, and started counting in the small things, the number of times she had walked the long curve of the hull, the number of meals she had made, and eaten alone in the galley, that was the only room left aboard the ship that still had air in it. She had been a cook, before. That was the truth of it, the truth the Sithraxi would have found most impossible of all, if they had ever learned it. The great folded weight that had eaten 5 of their ships had, at its lightless center, in the one warm room left in 1100 meters of solid dark, an old woman, who used to cook for a crew of 900, and now cooked only for herself, and who had stayed aboard the Adamant Hearth, not to fight anything, but because someone had to, because a ship that has done what the Adamant Hearth had done should not be left to drift alone, and because she had volunteered 800 years ago, and a human keeps a promise even when there is no one left to keep it to. The Adamant Hearth was not a weapon, in the way the Sithraxi meant the word. She had been one, once. In the old war, the war whose name even Beatrix had half forgotten, the human fleets had learned that the only way to stop a thing that ate ships was to build a ship that could not be eaten, and the only way to build a thing that could not be eaten was to build a thing that ate the act of being eaten itself. The engineers had made the Adamant Hearth a hull that answered every scan with growth, that turned every measurement aimed at it into more of itself, that took the energy of being looked at and folded it inward into weight, denser and denser, forever, because a thing that grows heavier the more you study it is a thing you can never ever finish studying, and a thing you can never finish studying is a thing you can never crack open. They had built her to win a war by being impossible to understand, and then they had won the war, and the war had ended, and the thing they had built to end it was too dangerous to keep, and too holy to destroy, and so they had set it adrift in the deep dark, with a single keeper, and the count still running, and they had moved on, and they had died, all of them, generation on generation, until only the keeper was left. Beatrix Holloway felt the first scan touch the Adamant Hearth the way you feel a hand on a sleeping shoulder. She had felt many scans across 800 years, salvagers mostly, curious survey ships. Once, long ago, something patient and ancient that had looked for a very long time and then, wisely, gone away. She always felt them, because the ship and the keeper were not as separate as they had been when she first came aboard, after 800 years of being the only warmth in all that folded dark. When something scanned the Adamant Hearth woke, and Beatrix woke with it, and the two of them, old woman and older ship, read the reader together. She knew the Sithraxi the moment she tasted them. Not their name, she had never heard their name. But she knew what they were, the way the ship knew, the way the hull had been built to know, because the hull had been built precisely to recognize the one kind of enemy it was made to answer. A thing that eats ships, a thing that grows its weapons, a thing that can only ever solve a problem by bringing more mouths. The Adamant Hearth had been forged in a war against exactly that kind of thing, 800 years ago, and it remembered, the way old soldiers remember, and when the first feeder vine touched its skin it did not hesitate, because it had been built and blessed and left in the dark for the express purpose of never hesitating about this. Beatrix, in the warm galley at the lightless heart, felt the vine die and be unmade, and said, softly, to no one, "There you are." There had been a crew, once. 900 of them, in the old war, and Beatrix had cooked for every one of them, 3 meals a day, across the worst years of the worst war the humans had ever fought, in a galley that rang with noise and complaint and the small, fierce life of people who knew they might not see another watch. She had not been a soldier. She had told them so, the recruiters, 800 years and 1 lifetime ago, and they had laughed and said that a fleet did not run on guns, it ran on the people who fed the people who fired the guns, and they had been right. She had fed the gunners and the engineers and the captains, and she had learned every one of their names, and one by one across the long war, she had watched the names go quiet, until the war ended, and there were not 900 of them anymore but a few hundred, and then fewer, as the years that came after the war did what years do. When the order came to set the adamant hearth adrift, to send the unbeatable thing out into the deep dark where no hunger could ever reach it again, the engineers had asked for a volunteer to stay, a keeper, one person to mind the ship, to keep the count, to be the last warmth in all that folded dark for as long as a single human could last, which they thought would be a lifetime, which they did not yet understand would be 800 years, because they did not yet understand what living inside a thing that ate the act of being measured would do to the one who lived there. Beatrix had volunteered. She had cooked for the crew of the adamant hearth, and she would not let the adamant hearth go into the dark alone, and that was the whole of her reason, and it had been enough. She let them gather. That was the part that was hers, and not the ship's, the part the engineers had not built in, the part that came from 800 years of a single human mind, learning patience, the way only the very old and the very alone ever learn it. The ship, left to itself, would have folded the first survey vessel and been done. Beatrix understood, the way the ship could not, that folding one would only send the rest away to come back later, in a different system, against people who did not have an adamant hearth between them and the mouth. So she waited. She let the wounded ship flee and live, so that it would carry word. She let the flotilla master rage and call for more. She let the maw fleets come, all 11 nest mothers, all 440 hulls, the whole gathered hunger of the thing the adamant hearth had been built to end, into one place, around one ship, in the open dark, and she did it the way she had once timed a meal for a crew of 900, so that everything would be ready at exactly the same moment. She thought about stopping them, in those 2 long days of waiting. She thought about it more than once. She was not a cruel woman, and she had no hatred for the Sithraxi, who were only hungry, who could not help what they were any more than a tide could help coming in. She knew, in the warm small galley at the heart of the dark, that every ship gathering around her carried hundreds of living things, who had families they would never see again, young ones barely out of their molt, old ones near the end of their service, all of them brave in their way, and all of them about to be folded into points because their leaders could not imagine a thing they could not eat. She felt the weight of that the way she felt everything now, completely, and it did not stop her, and the reason it did not stop her was the oldest and simplest reason there is. She had counted the worlds. The adamant hearth still kept its banks, and its banks still held the records of the old war, and across 800 years, Beatrix had read them all, the long, terrible list of the worlds, the thing that 8 ships had emptied before the humans built a hull it could not crack. She knew what the Sithraxi did to a world. She knew the silence they left behind, the worlds remembered as a place where ships used to be, and she knew, with the cold clarity of someone who had done this arithmetic in the dark for longer than any other living mind, that if she let this host go home unfolded, they would not go home and be at peace. They would go home and tell the others that the dark held a thing worth eating, and the others would come, more of them, always more, and they would not come to the adamant hearth, which they would learn to avoid, but to the small, warm, crude living worlds that had no adamant hearth between them and the mouth. To fold 440 ships was a terrible thing. To let them go was to feed 1,000 worlds to the dark. She had been a cook. She understood, better than any admiral ever had, that to keep some people fed, you sometimes had to be the one who decided what the meal would be. When the host of the Sithraxi raised their beams to scan the adamant hearth in unison, to find the seam, to learn the prey, Beatrix Holloway set down the cup she had been drinking from, in the warm small galley at the heart of 800 years of folded dark, and she said the only words she said in the whole long encounter, and she said them not to the Sithraxi, who could not hear her, but to the ship, who could. "All right, old girl," she said, "show them what we are." And the adamant hearth, which had spent 2 days letting itself be gathered around, which had spent every second of every scan since the first beam touched it, learning the exact weight and shape and hunger of every single ship in that vast host, opened the door at its lightless heart all the way, for the first time in 800 years, and gave the Sithraxi back what they were. It happened all at once, which was the mercy of it and the horror of it both. 440 warships had aimed their beams at the human battleship to read it, and the human battleship read all 440 of them in the same instant, completely, down to the last grown cell and bred bone, and it understood them entirely, the way it had been built to understand the thing it was made to end, and having understood them entirely, it gave each of them, in the same instant, the one thing a creature made of hunger could not survive being given. It gave them weight, not the slow climbing tide it had used on the first 5 ships. There was no time for tides now, and no need. The adamant hearth had 800 years of folded mass at its heart, more weight than a star, pressed down into a point too small for light to leave, and it shared that weight outward across the whole host at once, into every hull that had dared to scan it, the way you might pour a flood into 440 cups. The nest mothers, 11 kilometers of living dreadnought, got heavier than worlds in the space of a breath. The cruisers got heavier than the nest mothers. The feeder vines, blind and hungry, got heaviest of all, because the hull knew them best, knew them as the mouths they were, and gave the mouths the most. The old reader Dovril Cain, on his nest mother at the inner edge of the host, had time for exactly one thought before his ship folded, and the record never captured it, because there was no one left to log it. But Osenvel, watching from the far edge, always believed he knew what it had been, because it was the same thought he himself had had in the 9th hour, the thought every reader has when the honest machine finally tells him a thing he cannot survive knowing. It was looking back, the whole time. It was looking back. Dovril Cain had read it gently, the way he had promised, a soft, careful scan, enough to find the seam and no more, and it had not mattered in the slightest, because the human hull did not count how hard you looked. It counted only that you looked, and the old reader had looked, and that was enough, and the seam he had been searching for did not exist, because there was no seam, because the thing was not a shell with something inside it, the thing was solid all the way down, the thing was the answer folded into the shape of the question. And the entire war host of the Sithraxi, 440 ships, 11 nest mothers, the largest gathered hunger in a generation, folded. There was no fire, there was almost no light. There was simply, in the space of a single human breath, an unmaking, a great silent collapse, as every ship that had come to feed was given more than it could ever hold and dragged down into the only place that much weight can go, which is inward, forever, toward a center it would never reach. 440 points appeared in the dark, where 440 warships had been. They were very small and very heavy, and the beam could not see into any of them, and they were, every one, exactly the kind of thing the adamant hearth had been all along, because that was the mirror of it, that was the whole terrible point. The Sithraxi who ate ships had been fed, at last, until they became the very thing they ate. They had spent 2 days scanning a thing to learn what it was, and what it was, it turned out, was them. Just them. Themselves, folded into the shape of a battleship and left in the dark, holding up a mirror, waiting 800 years for the day they would line up to look into it. Beatrix Holloway picked her cup back up. She had not moved from the galley. She did not watch it on any glass, because there were no glasses, because the adamant hearth had not needed eyes for a very long time. She felt it instead, the way she felt everything now, the great host folding all at once into points in the dark, and she did not cheer, and she did not grieve, because she was 800 years old, and very far past both, and because she understood better than anyone alive or dead what had just been done, and why it had had to be done, and what it cost to be the one left to do it. She felt the host fold, she felt the dark go quiet, and then, last of all, she felt the one ship at the far edge that the hull had spared, the wounded survey ship that had cut off its own hand and fled and lived, the one ship she had left alive on purpose because a lesson with no one left to learn it is not a lesson at all. "Let that one go," she said softly to the ship, though the ship had already decided to, because the ship had been built by people who understood that the whole point of a mirror is that someone has to walk away from it, changed. And on the reading deck of the Patient Harvest, at the far ragged edge of where a war host used to be, reader Ausenvel watched 440 ships become 440 points of unbearable dark, and he did not look away, because he had ordered the logging, and someone had to remember exactly what they had done and exactly when they should have stopped. The Patient Harvest fled, and the human battleship let her, and that was the part Ausenvel would spend the rest of his life trying to understand, and never would. He took the Harvest out of the system at the highest burn her wounded body could hold, and for the whole long climb out of the dark, he sat on the reading deck with his beam fixed on the thing behind them, waiting for the weight to come for him too. It did not come. The adamant hearth, 1,100 meters of scarred gray stillness, hung at the center of 440 new points of folded dark, and did nothing at all. Its power signature was nearly zero. Its threat assessment, on the last glass of the last ship of the pack, still read negligible, and Ausenvel looked at that word for a long time, and then he did the only honest thing left to a reader who has learned that his instruments cannot see the truth. Threll Asha sat beside him for the whole climb out, and she did not speak for the first many hours, and then, when the system was far enough behind them that the points of folded dark were only the faintest bend in the readings, she asked the question Ausenvel had been dreading, because it was the right question, and because he did not have an answer for it. "Should we turn off our beam?" she said. "We are still scanning it. We are scanning it right now, watching to see if it follows us. If looking at it makes it stronger, then we are feeding it, this very second, just by being afraid of it." Ausenvel looked at her for a long moment. She was barely past her second molt, and she had just thought of the thing that the entire war host of 440 ships had not thought of, the thing the flotilla master had not thought of, the thing the 11 nest mothers had not thought of, and she had thought of it because she was frightened in the right way, and the others had been confident in the wrong way, and that was the whole difference between the two of them, and all the folded dead behind them. "Yes," he said quietly, and he reached out, and he turned off the beam. The reading deck went dark, in a way it had not been dark in 40 years. To turn off the beam was to go blind. A Sithraxi survey ship without its beam was a thing crawling through the dark, unable to see what was in front of it, and every instinct in Ausenvel's body screamed against it, because his whole life had been the beam, his whole science had been the looking, his whole people had been built on the certainty that to understand a thing you pointed light at it and measured what came back. And he had just learned, at the cost of 2,000 and then 440 ships, that there was one thing in the dark where the looking was the dying, where understanding was the trap, where the only safety lay in being willing, for the first time in the history of his people, to not look. He flew the Patient Harvest home blind. He did not turn the beam back on until the forbidden system was a full day behind them, and when the readings came back, at last, clean and empty and ordinary, he found that the weight had never followed. The thing had let him go the moment he stopped looking at it, the way it had let him go from the start, and he understood then that this too had been part of the lesson, the last part, the kindest and the cruelest part, which was that the door out had been open the whole time, and the only thing that had ever kept anyone in front of the mirror was the refusal to stop staring into it. He turned the assessment off. He did not want the machine's comfort anymore. The machine had told him the thing was negligible from the first second to the last, and the machine had been built by his own people, and his own people had been folded into points because they had believed the machine, and Ausenvel decided, somewhere on that long climb out of the dark, that he would rather carry the truth himself than let a machine carry a lie for him ever again. He did not understand what the human battleship was. That was the thing. That was the wound that would never close. He had read the dark for 40 years, and he had read this thing for 2 days, more closely than he had ever read anything, with every instrument his people had ever grown, and at the end of it he knew exactly what it had done, and not one single thing about why. He did not know if there was anyone aboard it. The reading said no. The reading said it was solid, crewless, a folded weight with a lightless heart. But a thing that was only a weight did not choose, and the human battleship had chosen, over and over. It had chosen to wake when the vine touched it, and to sleep again when the vine was gone. It had chosen to spare the harvest the first time. It had chosen to let the host gather for 2 full days before it acted, when it could have folded the first survey ship and been done. It had chosen, at the end, to spare the harvest again, the one ship at the edge, the witness. A weight does not choose. Something inside that solid, lightless hull had been deciding things with patience and judgment, and what Ausenvel could only call mercy, and his instruments could not find it, and he would go to his death not knowing if it was a mind or a machine or a ghost or a god, or only the long cold echo of whatever people had built the thing and left it in the dark. He would never know why it spared him. That was the cruelest part, and he came to understand, slowly, that it was meant to be cruel. A thing that wanted to be feared would have killed everyone. A thing that wanted to be hated would have killed everyone, but made sure they knew its name first. The human battleship had done neither. It had let one ship live, and it had told that ship nothing, no name, no demand, no threat, no terms, and it had sent that ship home carrying a thing far heavier than the weight it had spared her, which was a question with no answer in it. What were you? Ausenvel brought the patient harvest home, and he made his report, and the report changed nothing and everything. It changed nothing, at first, because the Scythraxi were what they were, and what they were was a species that turned everything it met into food and weight and more mouths, and a species like that does not learn a lesson the first time it is shown. There were Maw Lords who heard Ausenvel's report and concluded only that 440 ships had not been enough, and who began to speak of gathering 1,000, 10,000, the whole hunger of the nest worlds, to go back and crack the human weapon open at last. Ausenvel had expected this. He had watched Gon Sethi do it in miniature, answer 5 folded ships by calling 440 more, and he had learned that there was a kind of mind that could only ever meet a wall by running at it harder, and that a great many of his people had that kind of mind. Gon Sethi himself was among the loudest of them, in the first season after, and that was the strangest thing of all, because Gon Sethi had been there. He had watched it with his own reading eyes. He had called the host and seen the host fold and ridden home on the one ship the human hull had spared, and he had learned nothing, because there was a hollow place in him where the learning should have gone, and into that hollow place he poured only the demand for more. He stood before the Maw Lords and he did not say, "I led 440 ships into a thing I did not understand, and it folded all of them." He said instead that the human weapon had been wounded by his assault, that it had spent itself, that one more host, larger than the last, would finish what he had begun. He did not say that the hull had never moved, never fired, never spent anything at all. He had been there, and he lied, not to others first, but to himself, because the truth was a thing he could not hold any more than his ships could hold the weight, and so he folded it down small inside himself and called it victory. Ausenvel stood up in that same hall, an old reader with no standing left and nothing to lose, and he did the one thing that Gon Sethi could not survive, which was to play the log. He did not argue, he did not accuse. He simply put the readings up where every Maw Lord could see them, the ones from Gon Sethi's own ships, the honest machines, the curve that only went one way, and he let the numbers say what no Sithraxi voice was permitted to say, which was that the flotilla master had led the largest host of a generation to its death against a thing that had not so much as twitched, and that he was now asking to do it again, bigger. The hall went very quiet. Gon Sethi did not speak again. He left the service not long after, into a kind of silence the Sithraxi reserved for those whose hunger had cost too much, and Ausenvel took no pleasure in it, because the same hollow place that had killed 2,000 and then 440 was a place that lived, in some smaller measure, in every Sithraxi alive, and he knew it, and that knowledge was the heaviest thing the human hull had ever given him. So he did the only thing a reader could do against it, which was to make the record impossible to ignore. He had logged everything. Threlasha had logged everything, every reading, every second, from the first climbing number to the last folded point, and Ausenvel took all of it, and he did not soften it, and he did not shape it into a story of a weapon to be beaten, because it was not that, and a reader does not lie. He laid it out exactly as it was. Here is a thing that gets heavier every time you scan it. Here is the proof, in numbers, in your own honest machines, that the harder you study it, the more it grows. Here is the moment 5 ships scanned it and folded. Here is the moment 440 scanned it and folded. Here is the curve. The curve only goes one way. The curve says that there is no number of ships that wins, because every ship you add is one more scan, and every scan is one more meal, and the thing was built by someone who understood your hunger better than you understand it yourselves, and made a weapon out of it that cannot be beaten by more. He made them look at the curve. He could not make them understand the why, because he did not understand the why, but he could make them understand the curve, and the curve was enough, in the end, for the ones whose minds could be reached at all. The Maw Lords who wanted to gather 1,000 ships looked at the curve and went quiet. 1,000 ships was 1,000 scans, was 1,000 meals. The curve did not care how hungry you were. The curve only cared how many times you looked, and the answer it gave was always the same, and the answer was, you cannot win by looking harder at the thing that grows the more you look. And so the Sithraxi did the one thing in 900 years they had never done. They left a system uneaten. They drew a line around the dark where the adamant hearth hung among its 440 folded ghosts, and they marked it on every chart as a place that was not to be scanned, not to be approached, not to be studied, not to be fed, and they turned their endless patient hunger elsewhere, and they did not speak of why, because the why was a wound, and a species made of appetite does not like to look at its own wounds. There were other species in the dark too, who heard about the line on the chart, the small dark circle no Sithraxi hunger was allowed to cross, and who wondered. Word travels even where it is forbidden to speak, and across the long years the story of the forbidden system spread in pieces, half a rumor here, a captain's nervous joke there, the way the deepest truths always travel, never whole, never plain. A few of the curious came to look. Other survey ships of other peoples, drawn by the same thing that draws anyone to a place that frightens a thing that frightens everyone else. They came to the edge of the dark circle, and they aimed their beams across it, at the 1,100-meter shape, hanging gray and still at its center, and they read it, and the number began to climb. None of them died. Beatrix saw to that. The ship, left to itself, might not have made the distinction, but the keeper at its heart had learned the difference between a hunger that would empty a world and a curiosity that only wanted to understand, and she let the curious read their fill and gave them nothing but the climbing number and the same question she had given the Sithraxi. They went away unfolded and deeply afraid, every one, and they added their own small piece to the rumor, and the rumor that grew up around the forbidden system was not, in the end, a story about a weapon. It was a story about a mirror. Do not look too long at the gray ship in the dark, the story went, in a dozen tongues across 100 years. It does not hurt you. It is worse than that. It shows you exactly what you are, and then it lets you live with it. That was the legend the adamant hearth became, and it was the truest legend in the dark, because for once a legend had grown up around a thing that was exactly as strange as the stories said. The gray ship did not chase anyone. It did not demand anything. It did not even seem to want to be left alone. It simply hung there, century after century, an old battleship with a soft, small, gentle name painted 3 meters tall on its bow, and it answered every beam aimed at it with the same patient growing weight, and it asked everyone who looked the one question that no instrument in the galaxy could ever measure or scan or fold, the question that was the only weapon it had ever truly carried. Beatrix Holloway felt them stop coming. It took years. She was patient, the way the very old are patient, and she felt the scans grow rarer, and then stop, felt the dark around the adamant hearth go truly quiet for the first time in 800 years, and she understood that the thing she had waited for had finally happened, that the lesson had landed, that the one ship she had spared on purpose had carried the question home, and the question had done its slow work. She sat in the warm galley at the lightless heart of the folded dark, the only warmth in 1100 meters, and she made herself a meal, the way she had made herself a meal every day for 800 years, and she ate it alone, and she was, in the only way that still meant anything to her, content. She would not last forever, she knew that. Even a keeper ends. But the ship would last, the adamant hearth would hang in the dark long after the last warmth in it had gone cold, and it would still answer every scan with growth, still turn every measurement into weight, still be impossible to understand and therefore impossible to crack, forever, a mirror set in the dark for any hunger that came to look into it. She had done what she promised, 800 years ago, when she volunteered to be the one who stayed. She had kept the ship, and the ship had kept the dark, and the dark, for the first time in 9 centuries, was a little safer for the small, warm, crude living things that flew through it, because of one old battleship and one old cook, and a promise neither of them had ever broken. She did not know the name of the species she had folded. She would never know it, and that was right, somehow. They had not known her name either. The adamant hearth had never been about names. It had been about a single hard truth, learned in a war 800 years gone, that the only way to stop a thing that ate ships was to become a thing it could never finish eating, and to wait, and to be patient, and to let it come, and to hold up the mirror when it did. She had been the patience. The ship had been the mirror. Together they had been enough. Far away, in the nest worlds, Reader Osenvel grew old. He did not return to the survey service. He could not. He had spent 40 years pointing beams at the dark to learn what was in it, and he had learned, at the very end, that there were things in the dark that pointing a beam at only made worse, and a reader who believes that cannot read any more. So he taught instead. He took the young ones, the ones barely past their second molt, the ones who had grown up cheering the recordings the way he had once cheered them, and he sat them down in front of the logs, all of it, every reading, every second, the climbing number and the woken sea and the unmade vine, and the 5 ships, and the 440, and he made them watch it, and he made them understand the curve. And then he told them the part the curve could not show, the part that mattered most, the part he had carried home alone. We never learned what it was, he would say, every time, to every new class, in the same quiet voice. Understand that. We had every instrument our people ever grew, and we read it more closely than we have ever read anything, and we do not know what it was. We do not know if anyone was aboard it. We do not know why it waited. We do not know why it spared us. We know only what it did, and what it did was this. It let us scan it. It let us bring everything we had. It learned exactly what we were, down to the last cell, and then it gave us back exactly what we are, and what we are turned out to be the thing that killed us. That is the whole of it. We did not lose to a weapon. We lost to a mirror, and we will never know who was holding it up. Selland. The young ones always asked the same question, every class. There was always one, sharp and young and certain, who asked, then how do we beat it? How do we win against a thing like that? And Osenvel always gave them the same answer, which was the only true thing he had brought home from the dark, the thing that was worth more than every reading in every log, the thing it had taken him 40 years and 440 folded ships to learn. You don't beat it, he would say. You don't go back. You leave it in the dark, and you turn your hunger elsewhere, and you become a people who can leave a thing alone. That is the whole lesson. There is no weapon at the end of this story. There is only a choice. And the choice is this. You can keep being a thing that turns everything it meets into food and weight and more mouths, in which case the dark has a mirror waiting for you, and it is very patient, and it does not miss. Or you can be something else. The humans built that thing 800 years before any of us were hatched, and then they vanished, and we never found another like it, and we never found them, and I have come to believe that they did not build it to win a war. I think they built it to ask a question. I think they built it to sit in the dark and wait, and ask everything that came hungry the same quiet question, over and over, forever, and the question is this. And here he would always stop, and look at the young ones, and let the dark of the room hold the question the way the dark of space held the ship. The question is, are you sure you want to look? He never answered it for them. He had decided, long ago, that it was not a question with an answer you could give to someone else. Each of them had to carry it home alone, the way he had, the way the patient harvest had carried it out of the dark, the way the one spared ship was always meant to. He only made sure they heard it. He only made sure that when they grew up and took their own beams out into the deep dark to learn what was in it, they would remember that there was at least one thing out there that grew the more you studied it, that gave you back exactly what you were, that asked you a question with no answer in it and let you live so you could carry the question home. He died old, on a nest world, a teacher, far from the dark he had read for 40 years. His last class kept the logs. They passed them down. The line around the forbidden system held, generation after generation, on every chart the Sithraxi ever made, a small dark circle no hunger was allowed to cross, with no explanation written beside it, because the explanation was a wound, and a wound does not need words once it has taught you to stop touching it. And in the center of that dark circle, the adamant hearth hung among her 440 folded ghosts, scarred and gray and still, her power signature nearly zero, her threat assessment, to any machine still foolish enough to read her, forever negligible. She did not fail. She did not retreat. She did not lose. She had been built to be impossible to understand, and she remained impossible to understand, which is the most complete kind of victory there is, the only kind that does not have to be defended, the only kind that wins simply by continuing to exist. Somewhere inside her, in the one warm room at the heart of all that folded dark, there had been an old woman who used to cook for 900 and stayed behind to keep a promise. Whether she was still there, in the years and centuries that followed, no scan would ever say, because no scan could see her, because the whole genius of the thing was that it could not be seen into, only fed. The Sithraxi never knew her name. They never knew the ship's name either. They knew only the dark circle on the chart, and the curve in the old logs that only went one way, and the question their oldest teacher had carried out of the dark and handed down to every class until he died, the question that was the only weapon the human battleship had ever truly fired, the question that had folded 440 ships and emptied a whole hunger out of a whole region of the sky, the question that hung over the forbidden dark forever and was never, ever answered. Are you sure you want to look? They had looked. They had scanned a human battleship. And from the first second that the number began to climb, to the last long silence after the host folded into points in the dark, every single one of them, down to the last reader on the last surviving ship, had wished with their whole hungry hearts that they never had.